Somewhere on the way to whatever you picture when you imagine healed, there's a stage nobody markets to you because it doesn't sell anything. It doesn't come with a hashtag, it doesn't photograph well, and yet it's the only stage, the oldest alchemical texts we have actually bothered to name. You've been told transformation looks like a light switching on, one decision, one retreat, one breakdown you can point to later and say, that's where I changed. But that's not what the record says. What the record says is stranger, older, and a lot less convenient than a before and after photo. There's a pattern underneath everything you've already survived without naming it. A pattern with a real name, written down by a real person, in a real year, in a text you can still go find today if you don't want to just take my word for it. And once you see the shape of it, you can't stop noticing where you already are inside it. If some part of you keeps waiting for the sign that says it's finally over, I need to ask you something before we go further. What if the sign already happened and you missed it because it didn't look like anything at all? What if it looked like silence, exactly where a familiar weight used to sit? To understand what I mean by that, we have to go back almost 2,000 years to a city in Egypt and to a man who wrote down something he saw happen to a priest standing at an altar. I'm going to tell you what I lived, not in metaphor. I'm not going to describe a feeling and dress it up as a vision, and I'm not going to hand you a technique and pretend it came from somewhere ancient just because that sounds more convincing on a thumbnail. What I'm about to tell you has a real foundation underneath it, something written down by named people in specific years, long before either of us was born, in texts that survive to this day and can be checked by anyone who doesn't want to just take my word for it. That part isn't mine to invent, and I wouldn't want it to be. The part that's mine, the only part, is what happened to me after I found it, and what I did with it once I understood what it was actually describing. There's an Egyptian alchemist named Zosimos who wrote in Panopolis, a city in Egypt we now call Akhmim, sometime around the year 300. He's the oldest surviving author of systematic alchemical writing that we have. And in his visionary texts, he describes something specific, a priest standing at an altar being taken apart, boiled, and then recomposed, not destroyed, reassembled. That image is the oldest record we have of a pattern that later traditions would come to name in 3 distinct stages. More than 1,000 years after Zosimos, a text called the Rosarium Philosophorum was printed in Frankfurt in 1550 as part of a larger alchemical collection. It didn't invent the pattern Zosimos had already glimpsed. It gave it a fixed vocabulary, 3 words that would travel across the centuries into every alchemical text that came after. Nigredo, the blackening, albedo, the whitening, and Rubedo, the return of color, of blood, of heat, the final stage. And here's the part I want to be honest about, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes any of this worth your time. The alchemists who practiced this, going back through the Greek and Arabic traditions, claimed their art descended from one figure, Thoth. Not as a documented author with a signature on a scroll. There's no proof of that kind of authorship, and I won't pretend there is, but as an origin they themselves reached for. The people who practiced this, generation after generation, said this knowledge came from Thoth. That's not something I'm claiming as historical fact. That's a claim they made about their own work, and it's worth knowing because it tells you this tradition never thought of itself as separate from something older and Egyptian and deliberately hermetic, a lineage, not a decoration borrowed for atmosphere. So what is Rubedo actually? According to the Rosarium and the tradition that carried it forward, Rubedo is the final stage of a 3-part process, not a sensation you can chase and land on by itself, but the result of having gone all the way through the first 2. You don't arrive at Rubedo by wanting warmth. You arrive at it by having already gone through the blackening, where things you built your identity around fall apart on their own timeline, whether you're ready or not, and the whitening, where what's left of you gets stripped down past the point of comfort, past the point where you can still perform being fine. Rubedo is what's on the other side of both of those, completed, not a reward for finishing, just what remains once nothing left is pretending anymore. And here's what it is not, because the version sold to you online is almost always wrong, and I want to say this plainly. It is not constant ecstasy. It is not a permanently high vibration you achieve once and then live inside forever, immune to bad days, immune to grief, immune to a bad night's sleep. It's not something you can buy or accelerate with one isolated technique or claim while you're still standing in the middle of it, breathless, wanting it to be true. You don't get to decide in the moment that you've reached it. Nobody does. It's recognized afterward, always afterward, the way you only know a storm has actually passed once you've been standing in the quiet long enough to trust that it's not circling back. For a few months before anything shifted in me, I had a habit I never gave a name to at the time. I wasn't following a breathing technique or a program. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to dress this up as more organized than it was. Every time I felt the pull to give up on something that actually mattered to me, a conversation I was avoiding, a habit I kept promising myself I'd break, a version of my life I said I wanted but kept quietly sabotaging, I would stop right there and just notice where in my body that pull was sitting, not why, just where. Some nights it sat low behind the navel. Some nights it was higher, tight across the chest, right around the heart center. I wasn't trying to fix it or breathe it away. I was just watching it the way you'd watch weather pass over a field without doing anything about the weather at all. It wasn't dramatic. Some nights I'd notice the weight, name its location silently, and go back to whatever I was doing. That was the entire practice. No candle, no ritual object, nothing that would make a good photo. Just a person repeatedly refusing to let the resistance stay anonymous. Looking back, I think that's closer to what Zosimos and the Rosarium actually describe than anything more elaborate. The nigredo isn't a performance. It's attention applied to the part of yourself you'd rather not look at for longer than feels comfortable. Then came one specific night. I want to be honest that this part is the story of what happened to me. Take it as my account, not as a rule for what has to happen to you. It was the middle of the night, no sleep, in the middle of a relapse into an old pattern that already felt like the 100th time I'd been here. Same script as every other night like it, the same argument I have with myself, the same excuses lined up and ready. Except this time, a light tingling moved up through my arms, almost like a shiver, but not cold. My breath dropped deeper without me deciding to breathe that way. And the weight that always pulled me back into the old pattern, the thing that always won every single time before this one, simply didn't pull. It wasn't there to fight anymore. There was no light, no voice, nothing I could point to and say, that was the moment. It took me minutes to even notice because it wasn't a click. It was a silence, and I only recognized it as anything at all because it kept lasting longer than any silence like it ever had before. In the days after, the signs came in a sequence, each one a little sharper than the one before it. First, a conversation that would have irritated me a week earlier. One of those small comments that used to sit in me for hours, passed through me and left nothing behind. No residue. No replaying it later that night while I tried to fall asleep. Then a piece of bad news arrived, the kind that would normally have sent me looking for a wall to brace against, and instead I felt the whole thing, completely, without needing to protect myself from it at all. It didn't hurt less. It just didn't need managing. And finally, one ordinary morning, nothing special about it, just coffee and traffic and the usual noise, it hit me that it had been a while since I'd felt that old weight at all. I sat with my coffee going cold and actually tried to remember the last time I'd felt it, and I couldn't. It was just gone, the way a bruise fades and you only notice because you go to press on it out of habit and there's nothing there anymore to flinch at. Before I connect any of this back to Zosimos or the Rosarium, I want to examine it instead of just declaring it, because I think that's the difference between honesty and performance, and this channel would rather be honest than convincing. It wasn't a conclusion I wanted to reach. It was something I only recognized days later without having decided anything on purpose. If I'd forced that recognition, if I'd talked myself into believing it because I wanted it to be true, because it would make a better story, it would have just been willpower wearing the costume of insight, and I'd know the difference even if nobody else could. What actually happened arrived without me asking for it, and in that same moment, I found myself wondering, without needing to answer it, and I still don't, all these months later, whether what shifted came from somewhere outside me, some presence or influence I can't name, or whether it came purely from inside, something that had simply finished its own work in its own time, on a schedule I never had access to. I can't tell you which one it was. I'm not going to pretend I can, and I don't trust anyone who claims they always know. What I can tell you is that both possibilities, for me, carry the same weight. Neither one makes what happened smaller. That's when I went back to Zosimos and to the Rosarium and read them differently than I had before. The figure taken apart and recomposed at Zosimos' altar was never really about dying. It was about what's left standing once the old shape can no longer hold itself together, once the form you built your identity around simply can't keep pretending to be structural anymore. And the Rosarium never describes Rubedo as a new color painted over something plain. It describes it as the return of something that was already there the entire time, just buried, first under the ash of the nigredo, then under the cold white of the albedo. Two texts 13 centuries apart, describing the same recovery, not an addition, a remembering. If any of what I just described is starting to sound familiar to you, not identical, nobody's story repeats exactly, but familiar in its shape, there are 9 signs I want to walk you through. They come from watching this pattern in myself and in the handful of people close to me who went through something similar, organized in 3 layers, each one going a little deeper than the one before it. The first layer is what I'd call the common field. 3 signs live here, and they're the quietest ones. Nobody posts about these. The first is that you stop needing your transformation to look special. The field around you gets ordinary, quiet, unremarkable, and that's not a loss, that's the whole point. You stop scanning for proof that something happened because you're not performing it for anyone, not even for yourself. The second is that your emotions come back fully, all of them, without controlling you anymore. Grief, anger, joy, they move through you the way weather moves through a field. Arriving, passing, never staying to run the place. You feel more, not less, and for the first time, none of it knocks you over. The third is that you can hold 2 opposite truths in the same space without needing one of them to win. Someone can disappoint you and you can still love them completely in the same breath without your mind forcing a verdict. In the body that shows up specifically as a chest that doesn't tighten, right at the heart center, even when both sides of you disagree with each other. The second layer moves into how you relate to other people, and this is where most of what changes actually gets noticed by the people around you, even if they can't name what it is. The fourth sign is that loneliness changes texture. It stops being isolation and becomes a kind of quiet that's actually full, not empty. You can be completely alone in a room and feel nothing missing. The fifth sign is that you stop trying to pull the people around you into your own rhythm. You let each person's field move at its own pace without needing them to catch up to where you are, without needing them to understand what happened to you in order for it to have been real. And the sixth sign is that the past stops pulling at your solar plexus specifically. That's where it always used to grab first, for me, and probably for you too. The memory is still there. You haven't forgotten anything. But the weight attached to it, the thing that used to yank you backward the second the memory surfaced, just isn't there to pull anymore. If you've recognized 3 or more of those 6 signs in yourself while I've been talking, I guess some part of you already wants to write that down somewhere, put a word to it before it fades. So here's the word, crossed. If 3 or more of these are landing as true for you, write crossed in the comments below. I want to know how many of you have actually lived through something like this without ever having a name to put on it, because I didn't either for a long time. The third layer is what I'd call the presence that remains, and it's the one people ask me about most, because it's the hardest to describe without sounding like I'm exaggerating. The 7th sign is that desire itself comes back from a full place instead of an empty one. You want to create something, not escape from something. You'll notice the difference immediately once you feel it. Wanting used to feel like reaching for a hole to fill. Now it feels like something already full, deciding to move. The 8th sign is that other people's states still reach you. This is the perception that sits quietly behind the third eye, the still point between the brows. You can feel it the second someone tense walks into a room, but it doesn't stick to you the way it used to. It passes through you the way wind passes through an open door. You notice it, and it keeps moving, and you're not carrying anyone else's weather home with you anymore. And the 9th sign, the last one, is quieter than all the others. A kind of still warmth settles into your presence, centered somewhere around the chest that has nothing to do with what you say or do. Nobody around you can quite name what changed. They just feel it the moment you walk into a room, and half of them will ask you what happened without knowing that's the question they're actually asking. There's a piece of this story that history didn't let survive easily, and I think it matters that you hear it before we go further. Tradition holds that in the year 296, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, after putting down a revolt in Alexandria, ordered the burning of Egyptian texts on transforming metal into gold, not because the knowledge didn't work, but because he feared what it could finance in the wrong hands. Think about that for a second. Nobody burns a library over something they think is nonsense. You burn what you're afraid actually does something. I want to be honest about where that account comes from, because this channel doesn't hand you a citation dressed up as more solid than it is. It's preserved through later Byzantine historical tradition, not a surviving primary decree we can point to and hold in our hands directly. But even as a preserved tradition, it tells you something real. This line of knowledge had, literally, a moment where a government tried to erase it by force. What survived in spite of that, not because nobody ever tried to take it away. I want to guide you through something now, the same motion I described from that night, revisited on purpose, this time with you, wherever you're sitting or standing right now. Bring your hand gently to your solar plexus, just below the center of your ribs. Notice, without judging what you find, whether there's any weight sitting there right now. No need to name it, no need to explain it to yourself. Just notice it's there, or notice it isn't. As you let your breath out slowly, imagine that sensation rising slowly from the solar plexus up toward the chest, and then settling back down again like a small wave, out and back. You don't need to picture color or light, just the movement itself, moving at whatever pace feels honest to you, not the pace you think it's supposed to move at. Let that small back and forth repeat 2 or 3 times, letting the intensity soften with every pass, the way a wave gets smaller each time it comes in. Keep your hand where it is a moment longer than feels necessary. There's no wrong version of this. Some of you will feel nothing move at all tonight, and that's still information, not failure. And when you're ready, come back to that night I described earlier. The change doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as silence, where weight used to be. I want to be honest with you about what came after, because I think the version of this story that only shows the good part isn't the whole truth, and you deserve the whole truth, not the highlight reel. It wasn't easy afterward. Old patterns came back, more than once, and some of them I genuinely thought were finished for good. The Rosarium never once described Rubedo as constant happiness. It described it as stability, and those are two different things that get confused constantly in every version of this that gets sold online. In the weeks that followed that night, the same old impulses showed up again. The difference was that they moved through faster. The weight recognized its own place sooner, and ordinary life picked its rhythm back up without needing another collapse to reorganize itself around. That doesn't undo the Rubedo. That's not a failure of the process. That's exactly what the Rosarium meant by stability, not the absence of difficulty, the absence of being ruled by it. There's one more thing worth naming before I close this, and it's the part almost nobody warns you about. The urge to turn around after something like this and start guiding other people can be genuine. Some people are actually built for that, and it's real work, and it matters, but it can also be the ego's last move to keep being special, this time dressed up as someone who's already arrived, someone who gets to stand at the front of the room instead of in the crowd. Those two impulses can feel identical from the inside. That's what makes this one dangerous. The real one usually feels quiet, almost inconvenient, like a job you didn't apply for. The other one feels like a stage, even when nobody's watching. I'd ask you to sit with it before you act on it, whichever form it takes in you, not to shut it down, just to look at it honestly, long enough to tell which one it actually is, before you follow it anywhere. The people who actually cross this don't come out looking transformed. They still go to the store. They still forget their keys. They still sit in traffic like everyone else, the same way Zosimos, after writing down a vision that's sacred, probably still had an ordinary Tuesday waiting for him the next morning, bread to buy, a door that's still stuck in the heat. That's not a downgrade from the vision. That's what the vision was always going to look like, worn as a life instead of framed as a memory. And I want to say this clearly because people always ask, there's no 10th stage hiding after this one, no secret level past Rubedo that only a few ever reach. The Rosarium doesn't describe anything past it. What continues from here isn't a higher level waiting to be unlocked. It's just the life lived from this point forward, gold the whole way through. So stop asking when this is going to happen to you. Start recognizing that it already has. You weren't the one who had to turn into gold. You were gold the entire time. You were just resisting being seen, buried under ash you mistook for your actual face. Zosimos wrote his vision down and went back to an ordinary life he never once described as small. Neither will you. If 3 or more of what I described tonight are already true for you, write crossed below. I'll be reading every one of them.